Hello and welcome back to Giant Talk. If you're a regular listener, you'll know me as Roger. I am the founder and chairman of There Be Giants and very much the proud host of the world's longest running OKR podcast, Giant Talk. And like I said, for those of you that are regular listeners, you'll also know that we regularly have very, very interesting conversations around OKRs and all things to do with OKRs. And very much in that vein, today I'm delighted to be joined by Rachel Bennett from HR Fusion. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Roger.
Now, Rachel and I have known each other for a while, and we were kind of reflecting on some common experiences, weren't we, about 6 months ago around the organisations that you worked in and the clients that we dealt with. And that's what we're here to talk about today. But before we dive into that, can you just share with the listeners a little bit about your story, what you've done, what you're doing now, that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, thank you for having me. I am a HR professional. I've been in HR for many years, 20 plus years. So probably been there and done that on most things in HR. Hence why the conversation around sort of collaborative working was of real interest to me. I recently, 6 months ago, left the corporate world to try a different tact in HR and become more of a HR consultant. Really passionate about culture and cultural change, and just felt that I might be able to help organisations with cultural change if I was a consultant assisting HR directors rather than being the HR director. So very, very new to this journey. So yeah.
Sure. So that's really interesting. So yeah, I mean, in that 20 years, I'm sure you've seen HR go through many, many different transformations in itself.
Absolutely.
Really. What would you say? I'm curious, actually. What would you say is represents the biggest shift from where it used to focus 20 years ago to where it generally focuses now?
It's had a huge shift, and actually probably just before I joined in HR was predominantly known as personnel. So it was typical tea and sympathy. And I remember kind of the first jobs I had in the finance world, HR was literally there for you to go in and, tell your woes to and very much counselling, etc. But it shifted through to much more of a operational service to start with, so much more around making sure the payroll's done, making sure that casework's done and learning and development. But now it's shifting very much more to a seat at the table. I see a lot of people with a seat at the table. So a lot more conversations around how people drive businesses as well as processes, etc. So huge shift and a shift in the right direction, but a long way to go. And like I say, this links beautifully into this kind of cross-team working and how we're stronger if we're working together. Yeah,
which nicely leads on to the subject that we're here to kind of chew over today. And that is when we had our heads together 6 months or so ago, we were reflecting on the fact that a lot of organisations still seem to struggle with cross-functional working, weren't we? And that silos are really, really present. In fact, I was only just talking to someone on a podcast recently, and I don't know if this is a term, but siloification.
Ooh, okay.
Siloification seems to be still quite prevalent, even though we've got no end of technologies and so on and so forth, and practices and new methods which are supposed to help with collaboration. A lot of organizations are still struggling with it. So, do you want to just share with the listeners what the focus of the piece of research was that you've done?
Absolutely. So the research was in two parts. So there was very much the academic side of the research, and then a little bit of testing it out, I suppose, on practitioners to see what their thoughts were. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the research didn't bring any surprises up really, but it was good to do. But actually, from an academic point of view, in one of the research papers from a company called PGI, they found that cross-functional working can increase innovation by up to 15%. So there's actual kind of proof out there from their surveys that it actually helps faster processes, gives you a lot more robust results, and improves that creativity and innovation. So that was really interesting, because from a practitioner that's been out there, when I see team working, if you take, for example, I don't know, a HR department designing, I don't know, a reward project, for example, if they did that in isolation and don't involve colleagues or payroll or finance, then actually they're going to come across an awful lot of problems. Whereas having that cross-team working and having the right people in the room means that they can get there faster without so many hiccups. So definitely from the external research, it shows 15% more collaboration, but there is another side to it, which was quite surprising, which was around 75% of cross-team working doesn't actually work. So that's quite interesting.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you just expand on that a bit for us?
Absolutely. So according to it's a Harvard Business Review, it is quite an old Harvard Business Review, so maybe it's worked come forward a little bit more now. But it does actually say 75% of the cross-team functions fail in at least 3 of the following 5 criteria. So they talk about meeting budgets. So there's an issue meeting budgets, staying on schedule. So a lot of wondering, adhering to spec, so whether they actually stay on the spec that's given in the first place, meeting customer expectations, and then managing alignment to their company goals. So what they're saying is, yes, in one publication, yes, it's good and can help innovation by up to 15%, but if you don't do it properly, then 75% is going to fail, which therefore arguably means you're going to be in a worse situation than you was before you started.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you say that is a paper that is from a number of years ago. I reading that or listening to that, I get a sense that that's probably through the use of, maybe, I suppose you might say, more traditional methods. I wonder if there was a more agile, iterative approach that was being taken, that cyclical, we check in every week, every couple of weeks or so on to make sure that we are on track and so on and so forth. I wonder whether that can go some way to sort of, addressing some of the potential points of failure that you mentioned.
Yeah, certainly. And talking to some of the people that are working cross-functionally, people are using a lot more things like Scrum and Agile working. And the OKR method also came up. So I think, from the research we're doing is very much around, it's great and it does work, but you've got to invest in it. You've got to put processes in place. You've got to look at the company culture and how the people are working. You've got to get the right people in the room together, and you've got to get the best results, you need to have quite a structured process. The research did show that cross-team working in an organic way still does work. But I would suggest that's when you've got a great culture. That's when you've got, your real self-managing cultures, which a self-managing culture, when it's working, I don't think you can beat it. I think it's fantastic. But they are quite progressive organisations that do that. So I think they could take that organic approach to this, whereas I think a lot of hierarchical, structured cultures, personally, I think they need that project management board, and they need the regular check-ins and etc.
Yeah, they need a bit of governance around it, don't they? I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, what we've come to find is that when a cross-functional team needs to kind of spool up, so to speak, spin up, it can bring together people that perhaps have never even worked before. And let's not forget that the good old team dynamics, they need time to form before they can really crack on with the work. Now, if you're talking about getting a team to focus on an objective that might only last for a quarter, they haven't got a huge amount of time to kind of do that forming. So they have to be able to kind of gel really quite quickly. And so we have kind of like a toolkit, which the head of that team can use, but also, the OKR coaches that we train up, they can also assist with that as well to facilitate it as you go through.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. What else did you find?
Well, just on the part that you were talking about, some of the things that you guys do, some of the top tips, I suppose, that's in the report around successful collaboration. So, we've talked about it can be successful, but we've talked about 75% of the time it's not always successful. So, looking at how you can make it successful, absolutely some of the tools that we've just talked about. One of the tips to boost the success of cross-team working that's in the report very much talks about assembling your team carefully. So exactly what you just said. You've got to make sure the right people are in the room. You've got the experts there that can hit the ground running and that can move forward. Again, it does talk about hosting the meeting. So making sure you've got an accountable person there, somebody there that is hosting it, that's accountable to make sure the meeting's happening, etc. And tracking the progress. That's the number 3, is to make sure that progress is tracked. Partly, in my opinion, to make sure you're still celebrating successes, because a lot of the time we forget to celebrate where we've come from and we keep focusing all the time on where we're going. The 4th one is very much around making the most of your meetings. So, making sure that those meetings are open and honest and transparent, helping people to be in a safe place that they can ask that stupid question, because that stupid question might be the one that holds them up. And then having that kind of real transparent decision making. I've actually been on quite a few projects in my time where you've got a really great structure, and everything's going brilliantly, but you don't know who can make the decisions. So that is a really crucial one, because what happens is you bottleneck. So you go so far, and then somebody says, "Oh, well, we need somebody to make this decision," and they go, "Oh, we'll take it away as an action." Well, actually, make sure that person's in the room. That action shouldn't need to go away. So I think that goes right back to that: assemble your team carefully.
Or there's sufficient empowerment in place for the people in the room to make that decision without having to pull that manager or leader in.
And I would absolutely argue that latter point is the more crucial. I think you really do need the right people in the room that can make the decisions, so that project can move forward. Again, a lot depends on what the project is as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. So there's a lot around, how our clients are using OKRs that kind of fits with this. Assembling your team carefully. Yes, you have to look at which areas need to make the greatest contribution towards that particular OKR, and that then guides you as to where you should be then inviting individuals from, and then you can kind of look at your shortlist in those areas and then invite them along. And you said about making meetings count. We've always talked about having, particularly when it gets to doing the check-ins, the regular check-ins, making sure that they're really short and sweet and very focused, because I'm acutely aware that time is in some respects often more valuable than money. And to have, you'll know as well as I do, there are organisations that just kind of run on nothing but meetings all the time, And you just think, oh my God, how much waste is there?
Yeah,
how much
absolutely.
waste is there?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I was talking to somebody earlier actually about the power of reflection, and actually, it's important, I think, for us all to remember that we're all different individuals, and we all have different kind of drivers. So some of us are hurry up drivers and perfectionists, and so to get a team together to work on a project, they're all going to have different kinds of maps of the world of where they've come from to be in that project. So I think it's taking all of that into account, and just giving it a real nod as well for diversity, and diversity of thought in these projects. It's massive, and the more diverse that you can get your project group with that empowerment, you're going to get a better outcome at the end of it. And the last point on that as well is around this concept of accountability versus responsibility. I think that's a real key one that I learned a few years ago, around having that every project should have an end-to-end accountable leader, and then you have the people in the room that are responsible for certain things. And quite often you hear the saying, don't you, too many cooks. And it's quite often a lot of projects will have more than one accountable leader. Well, you don't need that. You need one accountable leader, and then, people responsible for different elements of that project. So it is all about trying to get it to be a kind of a slick machine, as it were, that's going through, but that still gives that ability for people to be able to think for themselves and have that time to reflect and, have walking meetings and, looking after people's well-being at the same time.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reflective practice shows through in the in retrospective activity, and that pause, if only just for 5 minutes, just to look back and ask the question: could it have worked better? What has worked really well that we need to reinforce?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So, in terms of effectiveness of cross-functional working, you mentioned that stat from earlier on where 75%
pretty big, isn't it?
cross-functional efforts fail. Yeah, it's pretty big. Like I said, I do kind of have a certain amount of curiosity around that, because it may be not necessarily reflective of modern practice. But how do you go about, how does an organisation go about judging whether actually it's worth putting the effort into cross-functional working? What sort of payback can they expect?
Well, that was a really interesting one, and actually probably one of the curious things out of the whole of this research project, because we've seen as we've gone through that arguably, yes, it works to help innovation. Arguably, it doesn't work as much as we would like, because we need to have these things in place. But when you start coming towards the sort of the latter end of the questions, we start looking around, measuring the effectiveness. And from the people that we've spoken to, a lot of people don't actually measure the effectiveness. So that was one of the big surprises, that a chunk of those people didn't measure it, actually want to measure it, but not sure how to measure it. So that part was fundamental. And I think, going back on ourselves, some of the things that people did do that they sort of measured was working groups. They set up working groups. It was definitely the most popular kind of way of working, which was 73% of the people said that helps collaborative working with working groups. But they didn't really have a way of measuring whether that was successful or not. It was just a way of doing things. Then the kind of OKRs was actually the second most popular, but actually was measurable because of the system that you go through. There is a set measurable way there. Then the second two on there was agile project management and self-management teams, and both of those were a lot more measurable as well. So it was interesting that the thing that most people want to use at the top was working groups, which they can't measure so well, followed by some more sort of structured ways. The tools that, when we started going into some of the detail about, well, okay, what do you do to try and measure the effectiveness? It was things like informal one-to-ones. well, that's an interesting one, because what do we mean by that? Do we mean we've picked up the telephone to somebody to have a conversation with them, or is it a set sort of, Friday morning at 10 o'clock we've had a an informal one-to-one? There was the obvious things around individual objectives being set, but again there was that kind of, yes, they're set and they're not revisited for a year, so are they still relevant, and etc. And using project management summary reports was a popular one, and I think, from my own experience, sometimes that's more around you've got to if you've put something in on a project, you need to be reporting to the board or the exec on those kind of the way that project's working. So I wasn't surprised to see that one sitting there. And then somebody actually said it's measured by profit. So they do go through a structured process, and when it's profit driven. But the other people didn't measure it, but want to, which was the crucial part. It wasn't we don't measure it, we're not bothered. It was we don't measure it, but we want to, but we're not quite sure how to yet.
Do you know, it feels like you could almost build a maturity model out of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Couldn't you? Because there's a number of different variables, spectrums even. You've got kind of loosely defined working groups that are popular, but there's no real measurement of success with them. Going to the other end of the spectrum, where you've got something a little bit more transparent, a little bit more measurable, like the various different project management approaches, like Agile and so on. But then you've got a whole mix of things in between as well.
And I can't prove this. This is more my gut instinct. My gut instinct comes back to something you mentioned earlier on in the conversations around back-to-back meetings. And I think, from a cultural point of view, so many, certainly HR professionals that I talk to, are trapped in this busyness culture, let's say, where they are literally going from one meeting to the next, to the next, to the next. So taking time out to actually reflect and think about the project and, kind of work out a way that something's going to work kind of feels like a little bit of a luxury. So what happens is they set up project meetings or working groups because that's a quicker win to do. So the advice there would definitely be take a step back, do some reflection. If you want a proper kind of project management tool, there's lots of different types that you can use. Or you just take a step back and design something that's more in-house. But I do think a lot more time and reflection is needed, because we didn't speak to anybody that didn't care or didn't want to do this. It was very much this, this is what they do because that's what they've got time to do.
Okay. So from the research and listening to what people told you, if you were to advise our listeners on how best to approach this, let's assume that they haven't started cross-functional working at this moment in time. What are the 3 or 4 main points that you would give them to say these are the things you need to focus on if you want to get really good at cross-functional working?
So I think the first one would be to get a structured approach. Like I say, organic can work, but I'd definitely start off with structured to start with. I think organic's got its place when you know what you're doing, if you know what I mean. So I think the first and foremost thing is to start working up a structure that would work for your organisation. Secondly, would then be to have that kind of systematic approach that's going through that process for you, so that you know that you have a stand up on a Monday morning, you have a cool down on a Friday, or whatever the case may be. And then the last one would definitely be around your governance, making sure you've got a really strong governance, making sure that you are doing your minutes of your meetings, making sure that actions are being covered, that people are held to accountable. I definitely would add in there that kind of point I was making about having an accountable leader or accountable person, whatever you want to call them, but then having the people that are responsible, because that helps filter into your governance to make sure that things are moving forward. And then it's that kind of case of keeping a really close eye on this, making sure that improvements are being done, but also being flexible, because you might think something's going to work and then a week later it's not. Don't keep doing it just because that's what's in your plan. Adapt your plan. Quite often I see people, this is what I've got to do. I've got to go from A to B and I'm not stopping. Well, no, sometimes you've got to go around the Wrekin at the same time. So kind of having a really kind of structured governance and systematic approach. But the last say from me on that would be massively bad. Don't forget to have some fun and celebrate success. Because we really forget that we're at work a long time. We've got to love what we do, and we've got to have some fun doing it. And that's a really key part of it.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and it's always easier to focus in on the things that are not working at the expense of the things that are working.
And if you've got a cracking team, don't overwork them. Let them celebrate some successes. And, we're all human, and we're all there to do a good job.
I once read about, I can't remember the leader, but he was the head of some big agency in London, and they had a model whereby they actually put teams out to pasture for a while once they'd finished on a client project. So there was kind of like a 2-week period where they could not be assigned to another client. They were given a bit of time to decompress. I mean, I have a feeling that they probably wanted their pound of flesh when they were assigned.
But it swings and roundabouts, isn't it? And so often I speak to people that are just burnt out, that having that time out and introducing cultural things like walking meetings or a bit more flexibility and agile ways of working, that's where we're going as a nation. So I think we need to make sure we bring that into our projects. I really quite like the idea of having the time out as well. I think if you've got the right people, they will probably use their time out to, reflect and do some reading and listen to podcasts. And do you know what I mean? So they're not just lazing around. People that are genuinely interested in what they work on will work.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for providing us with that run through of the main findings of the research. I think we're going to be publishing the report pretty soon. So I can't say exactly where people can download it from, but what I can say is it will be in the show notes. So if you're listening to this and you want to grab yourself a copy, just have a look at the show notes and you'll find the necessary link in there. But if people want to reach out to you directly, Rachel, how can they do
LinkedIn, that? And I have a website as well, which is hr-fusion.co.uk.
Lovely. And it's for those that might want to find you on LinkedIn, it's Rachel Bennett.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, lovely. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. Pleasure. And thank you to those that have joined us to tune in. And I look forward to speaking to you all again soon on another episode of Giant Talk. Take care now.